This is a lesson video on the patterns that you can use for writing a thesis statement. Along with learning these patterns for thesis statements, you'll also learn about some sweet mustaches. Because the only thing more persuasive than a well-written thesis statement is an awesome mustache. So a couple of reminders before we get started. First of all, there's more than one way to write a thesis statement. We'll look at that. Also, just a reminder, you should have already seen this in our last video on thesis statements, but make sure in a thesis statement you do not use the phrases I think, I believe, or in my opinion. That tends to make your writing and your statement very weak. And finally, whichever pattern you choose, your thesis must still be debatable. It has to take a position very clearly, and it needs to be specific. Like I said, there's many ways to write a thesis statement. We're just going to look at a very specific way to do it and some different options in how you do it and kind of focus on that so you know at least one really specific way to write a thesis and you have options for writing it that way. If you don't feel like an expert in writing thesis statements, you're going to want to use these patterns in this kind of format. The basic format of what you're going to look at today will involve having a statement, and we'll show you how to do statements in pattern A or pattern B. It will have a transition word, like the word because is the most frequent one, and it will also have a reason or reasons at the end, which we'll show you in pattern C or D. And ideally, all three of these things together will make up a one sentence, good, clear, powerful thesis statement. The examples we'll look at for thesis statements will be based on two different prompts. I want to give you a second to look at both of these prompts. Go ahead and pause the video, read this first prompt carefully so you understand it. In case you weren't sure which part of this prompt was the actual question that they're asking you to do, this section right here, this sentence right here kind of sums up what they're asking you to do. Write an essay in which you explain your position on the relationship between ownership and sense of self. So some of the samples we look at today will be based on that prompt. Other samples will be based on this prompt. That last prompt was an AP argument essay prompt. This prompt is actually what you would see on the State of Texas STAR test. Take a minute, go ahead and pause this one and read this prompt. Again, in case you weren't sure, this sentence right here is the question of the prompt. Write an essay stating your position on whether you believe it is okay to break a promise. So some of the examples we look at will be based on that prompt. Let's start by looking at ways to do the statement portion of the thesis. So one way to do the statement portion of the thesis is to actually borrow directly from the prompt. And what we mean by that is you would actually take a position by using the same wording from the prompt in your thesis. You don't have to reword anything. You actually take the language they use to set up your writing task and you use that language in your thesis. What's good about this is it leaves no doubt that whether or not you addressed the prompt because you're using their very words. Here are two examples for the AP prompt about ownership and sense of self. If you use the language from the prompt, you might write, there is a negative relationship between ownership and sense of self. Or the other side of that would be, there is a positive relationship between ownership and sense of self. The statement part of the thesis would use the exact wording from the prompt. Remember this? You should recognize the exact wording I used in both of those statements. In both of those, I said there is a positive relationship between ownership and sense of self, or there is a negative relationship between ownership and sense of self. But I used the exact wording from the prompt. That's one way to do it. Same for the examples from the other prompt. You might remember from the other prompt. Write an essay stating your position on whether you believe it is okay to break a promise. In these statements, we said it is okay to break a promise or it is not okay to break a promise. It very clearly uses the language from the prompt. And that is a rock star mustache. If you ever seen anyone like that, be like, hey, nice rock star. And this is the abracadabra mustache, popularized by magicians everywhere, and very stylish if you ask me. Before we get into the second pattern here, you should check out the Regent, kind of like that one. And then, I mean, this one's great. You almost got a beard here, which you know I really respect. This is the Trucker. Okay, so now that you know a little bit about mustaches, let's get back to thesis statements. The second way to do the statement portion of your thesis is to not use the exact wording, but to rephrase the prompt's wording with your own words. And in this approach, you would take a position and just use different language of the words from the prompt and put them in your own words. For the first prompt, that might look like this. Owning things make us lose ourselves. Or the things we own help to show who we really are. These don't use the exact word for word words from the prompt, but they get to the same idea. They just say it in a different way. That's one way to do it. Notice, for example, for the second prompt, instead of saying it is okay or it's not okay, we want to elevate our language a little bit. We might say, keeping a promise can sometimes hurt someone, or it's morally wrong to not live up to your word. We're not using word for word from the prompt, but it's still getting at the same idea. You could use either one of those for the statements portion, and it fits just with what we looked at on those prompts. I always recommend for that statement portion using pattern A at first if you're not sure what to do on thesis, because that tends to be very clear and direct. Once you're a more confident writer and if you're more confident in your language skills, you might use pattern B. After the statement portion of the sentence, you'll usually have some sort of transition word or phrase. The most common and the most easy word to use, most easy transition to use is the word because. You don't really need much more detail than that. After you have your statement, your transition word, then you would actually include your reason or reasons. Most often you're probably going to have reasons for the AP test. And for those, you could use pattern C or D. Let's take a look at those. First of all, let's check out the boxcar. You know, if you're ready to hop on a train, you need a mustache like that. Or, you know, if you want to be a little more refined, go with the wisp. One way to do the reason portion of the statement is to kind of just summarize all of your reasons under an overarching concept. So, actually, in this approach, what you would do is after your transition word, you would offer an overarching, a big concept that all of the reasons that you listed can be categorized under. One thing you got to make sure of with this one, though, is that all of the reasons that follow in your essay, every point you make, that it fits under that overarching concept. That's a little bit harder to do, but it's very effective if you can do it well. With our practice prompts, you'll see they might look like this. Because things distract us from life's realities, or because the things we own reflect who we are. So you'd have the statement portion, okay, and then it would say, because things distract us from life's realities, or because the things we own reflect who we are. For the other prompt, it might look like this. Because some promises are bad, because broken promises cause problems. In any case, all of those general concepts, all of your reasons would have to fall underneath them. Let's look at Pattern D. But first, you've got the undercover brother mustache. Very well groomed, very straight, nice, classy. And then, my all time favorite, if you've got a little wax in your beard, you got a little wax you can put up in the mustache, you can always have the connoisseur. It takes a special person to wear a mustache like that. Okay, back to it. Pattern D for the reason section of your thesis would be listing all of the reasons you will cover. This is the safest way to do the reason portion of the thesis statement because whatever you list here are the exact things you will cover in your paper. There's no confusion. You don't have to make sure they fit underneath the overarching reason or anything like that. What you list is what you'll write about. So in this approach, after the transition word, you would literally just list each of the reasons you will discuss in order that they're going to appear in your paper and separate them by commas. And same thing though, any reason you list, sorry about the typo there, teachers make mistakes too. Any reason you list, you must cover in your essay. You can't list and say you're going to talk about something and then not talk about it. So that's one thing you need to make sure you do with this one. Let's look at some examples. So with the sample prompts we have, the reason section might look like, because owning things ties you down, comma, makes you selfish, comma, and changes your behavior. Or because the things you own can save you time, help you discover new things, and display your personality. There's no doubt of the points that I'm going to make in my piece of writing. The first point will be owning things ties you down. The next one would be it makes you selfish. And then the final one would be it changes your behavior. I would just have to provide evidence for each of those, and I would have written a really good essay. Same thing on this one. Let's look at them for the other sample. Because some promises end up hurting people, situations change, and people change. Or because promises are rare, could lose their meaning, and can cause distrust. All of these things listed would be points that I make and write about in my essay. It's a very clear, easy way to do it. So what does it look like to put all that together? Statement plus transition plus reason. Let's take a look. Let's say we used pattern A and pattern D together. There is a negative relationship between ownership and sense of self. Because owning things ties you down, makes you selfish, and changes your behavior. Or we could look at pattern B and pattern C. Owning things makes us lose ourselves. Because things distract us from life's realities. Then you could do pattern A and pattern C. It is okay to break a promise. Because some promises are bad. There's a good thesis. You could also team up pattern B and pattern D. Keeping a promise can sometimes hurt someone. Because some promises end up hurting people, situations change, and people change. Okay? Any of those patterns can be teamed up to make a strong thesis statement. You just have to know what you're doing and have a purpose, and it usually works out and results in a great thesis statement.